When knights of medieval Europe first rode into the Middle East, they expected honor, duels, and battles fought by rules they understood. Instead, they faced warriors who fought with speed, cunning, and weapons that turned the battlefield upside down. It wasn't just about strength anymore, it was about survival against an enemy who knew the land, mastered mobility, and shattered the image of knightly invincibility. Number 1. The First Encounters. When Christian knights first came face to face with Saracen warriors during the early Crusades, what they found was far beyond anything they had expected. The mindset, the weapons, the movement. All of it challenged everything a knight believed war should be. Knights were used to fighting close, heavy cavalry charges, shield walls, lances aimed with full force, swords hacking in tight quarters. Their training back in Europe emphasized strength, discipline, and shock. Hit your enemy hard, break his line, maybe take prisoners, maybe win glory in single combat. But the Saracens, especially those from the Seljuk Turks and Fatimids, introduced styles of warfare that subverted those expectations. The first major shock came in battles like Dorylaeum in 1097, where the Crusader forces found themselves vulnerable to hit-and-run attacks by fast-moving horse archers. The Seljuk Turks did not wait to meet the knights head-on. They circled, shot arrows, retreated, and then struck again. That broke up the cohesion of the heavy cavalry charge, slowed momentum, forced knights to protect themselves rather than impose their own tactics. Many horses were wounded or killed. Many knights exposed in gaps. Gradually, the knights realized that their armor and lances might protect them in single combat or in open fields, but in rough terrain and under constant ranged assault, those advantages melted away. There was also a psychological component. Rumors spread fast about Saracens' skill with archery, how they could shoot accurately from horseback, how they could harass columns on the march, interrupt supply lines, force constant alertness. Even nobles began to worry. The terrain added to anxiety. Narrow mountain passes, scorching deserts, unfamiliar climates. Knights were far from home, their horses weak from long travel, supplies uncertain. Every time they tried to advance, Saracen scouts and light cavalry seemed to appear out of nowhere, forcing delays and ambushes. Over time, what started as tactical surprise mutated into dread. They came to fear not just the blow of the enemy, but the unpredictability, when the next arrow volley might strike, where, and how. And knowing you are exposed, unable to mount the type of charge you trained for, that uncertainty eroded the confidence of many knights. Number 2. The weapons and tactics. Saracen forces brought tools and methods into battle that forced medieval knights to rethink everything they thought they knew about warfare. One of the biggest differences was the use of the composite bow. Made of wood, horn, sinew, and glue, these bows stored energy more efficiently than simple self-bows. They were lighter, could be shot from horseback, and allowed rapid, accurate fire over considerable ranges. Knights, accustomed to engaging enemies in close quarters or waiting for a cavalry charge to break enemy lines, were exposed to arrows long before they could close distance. The composite bow gave Saracen-mounted archers the ability to strike, withdraw, circle around, and strike again, disrupting charging formations and making the heavy cavalry's momentum unreliable. Because the bow draws well, even when buffeted by motion, these archers could attack while retreating or turning, something a knight in armor could not easily counter without taking damage. The Saracens also used light cavalry with curved blades, like the scimitar or saber, which excelled in slashing attacks and sudden close strikes once an enemy was worn down or disordered. Heavy armor protected well against direct thrusts, but slashing or hitting exposed joints neck, armpits, visor slits was still dangerous. The mobility of Saracen horsemen allowed them to pick their targets, harass horses, which were always weaker from long marches or heat, force knights to respond rather than dictate terms, and even desecrate supply columns. Those horses wounded by arrows or forced to run, fatigued rendered knights dismounted or less effective. Tactics involved feigned retreats, ambushes, repeated small skirmishes rather than a single pitched battle. Knightly training often emphasized the grand charge, the single decisive clash. facing foes who never stayed long enough for that, the knights had to shift from offense to constant defense, always alert. Noise and psychological warfare were not trivial. The clash of scimitars, the whinny of horses, cries, horns, drums. These could unsettle troops before a battle even began. Saracens, like many forces, used surprise, deception, attacks at dawn or dusk, striking supply lines, and the uncertainty these produced. Knights who believed in the invincibility of their armor and the superiority of heavy cavalry often found themselves exposed, wounded, or simply unable to use their strengths. The constant threat of ranged attacks meant that armor, although protective, became heavy liability under conditions of heat, terrain, fatigue. Over time, to face the Saracens meant to accept that your best weapons might often be less useful than your capacity to adapt. Number 3. The harsh reality of campaigns. Knights marching into Saracen territory quickly discovered that war wasn't only about swords, armor, and valor. Every day on campaign exposed them to trials they had rarely faced back home. The climate was often brutal, deserts baking under the sun, dry winds sucking moisture from bodies, nights either freezing or dangerously cold against the scars of the day. In places like the Levant, water sources were not only scarce, but often controlled by the enemy or hard to reach. One of the cruelest lessons came at the Battle of Hattin, where Crusader forces, after leaving reliable water behind and marching under scorching heat, found themselves dying of thirst and exhaustion before the main fight even broke out. The lack of hydration turned disciplined armies into fragmented, weakened groups. Supply lines struggled. Food spoilage was common. The scarcity of fresh meat or vegetables led to malnutrition. Even the horses, the pride and strength of many knights, worked into collapse from fatigue or dropped dead for want of water. Disease spread rapidly. When knights were confined behind walls during sieges or forced to encamp in swamps or damp valleys, illness like dysentery, fevers. Infections became as lethal as enemy swords. Sanitation was rudimentary. Wounds often became septic. Camps were breeding grounds for lice, fleas, mosquitoes. Poor hygiene and overcrowding exacerbated everything. Constant marching exposed men, not only to physical fatigue, but to emotional strain. Morale often slipped when knights saw comrades fall to illness rather than in battle. In accounts from the siege of Antioch, starvation was so severe that some men deserted, dying in the woods or among enemies in desperation. At Acre, during one winter, knights and foot soldiers were reduced to eating their horses as supplies ran out. Bread was sold at astronomical prices while many starved. Terrain added another layer of difficulty. Hills and mountains slowed progress. Deserts were featureless and misleading. Sudden storms could make rivers swell or paths muddy and impassable. Many knights, trained in European winters or summer battles in forests and fields, were ill-prepared for scorching plains or rocky passes. Heat exhaustion, blistered feet, sunburn, dehydration. Each soldier, each horse, carried the weight of these. Even castle sieges, which knights might expect to be defensible positions, became traps when supply convoys were cut. Rains turned moats into quagmires, and defenders ran low on water or food. The harsh reality was that failure to control logistics, environment, and disease often meant defeat before the battle even truly began. Facing the Saracens thus meant facing the land, the weather, illness, and supply forces outside the control of any knight's strength or skill. Number 4. Stories and legends that spread fear. In the early Crusades camps, tales about the Saracens traveled faster than arrows, and even when exaggerated, they shaped how knights saw their enemies and themselves. Stories claimed that some horse archers could shoot so precisely that arrows struck small targets at impossible distances. One popular legend spoke of Saracen riders picking off sentries at dusk, their arrows whistling like death through campfire smoke. Knights spoke of ambushes in which entire supply caravans disappeared overnight, sometimes with no survivors, sometimes with strange tracks vanishing into the desert dunes. These stories were rooted in real events. A hit-and-run raid here, a scouting party ambushed there, but amplified by fear and distance. One of the most respected adversaries was Saladin. His reputation wasn't just built on victories, but on how he treated opponents, how his army moved, and how they fought with combination of skill, timing, and cruelty. Christian chroniclers sometimes admitted, here was an enemy who commanded loyalty, had disciplined archers, deft strategy, and resilience. Knights like Richard the Lionheart publicly spoke of respect for Saladin, almost as if acknowledging that this Saracen leader was one who violated none of the unwritten rules of honor more than was necessary, and thus was more dangerous. The admiration itself felt like fear, because it admitted the possibility that the Saracens could outmatch the knights not only by numbers, but by strategy and moral authority. Beyond named leaders, there were ghost stories, rumors of night raids, of terror under moonlight, of Saracen scouts who could sneak into fortified camps and leave without trace. Such stories made many knights start doubting their armor, their watch rotations, their sense of safety inside walls. Tales of disease spreading through camp, of horses dying of thirst or fever, of men driven mad by fear of being the next Target-all. These got woven into the legend of the Saracens. Every legend carried an implicit warning. Your courage, your sword, your armor, none of it matters if you don't anticipate the untold. And when stories say that during the Battle of Hattin, thousands of Crusader horsemen had their mounts killed by massed archery before they could charge safely, or that even victories like Arsuf came only by narrow margins and great losses, those aren't just heroic or tragic narratives, they become cautionary tales. Knights heard them, thought of what might happen to them, and braced not just for battle, but for endurance, loss, unpredictability. That mental weight often shifted behavior.